By 1801, the young Lord Thomas Cochrane had won many battles, proving himself an exemplary warrior and passionate leader. But it would be this next chapter of his life that would see his fateful rise to legend and his ultimate fall from grace. Welcome to part 2 of our series on the life of Thomas Cochrane, which will examine how he earned a title bestowed upon him by Napoleon himself and his hard-headed defiance against authority. Shout out to Brilliant for sponsoring this video. We're happy to be partners with Brilliant, as this educational platform and our channel share similar values. Do you know someone who likes to ask, how does the refrigerator work? Or how do I solve this puzzle? Or maybe even, what is quantum computing? If so, we've got just the thing for you. Spread the love of knowledge and learning to your loved ones by gifting them Brilliant. This really excites us because it's such a fun way to nurture curiosity, build confidence, and develop problem-solving skills crucial to school, job interviews, or their career. Brilliant's thought-provoking content breaks up complexities into bite-sized, understandable chunks that will lead them from curiosity to mastery. Go to brilliant.org/kingsasgenerals and grab a gift subscription to help your loved ones finish their day a little smarter. On July 18, 1801, Thomas Cochrane stood aboard the deck of the 80-gun HMS Pompey to face a military court for the capture of HMS Speedy. However, he knew that the slew of unlikely victories he had won on his little sloop outweighed the cost of its eventual loss. Sure enough, Cochrane was honourably acquitted. With that out of the way, he had expected 3 things: a swift promotion to post captain, a shiny new frigate to command, and a return to the bountiful fame of Napoleonic warfare. Unfortunately, none of this would come to pass. The Royal Navy brass dragged their feet, and for 3 months he watched rival officers get promoted ahead of him. Although he was finally appointed post captain on August 8th, he had become resentful towards the British Admiralty, publicly berating the Lord Admiral St. Vincent, an act which would earn him ire from the aristocratic oligarchy that was British Naval Command. On May 18, 1803, Britain declared war on Napoleonic France once more. Cochrane, who had been unemployed during a year-long truce, was delighted to finally be deployed. Unfortunately, his ill-advised aggressions had come back to haunt him, as the vengeful Lord St. Vincent saw to it that the new post captain was stiffed again. Cochrane was appointed to command the HMS Arab, a destitute 6th-rate frigate which he equated to a flat-bottomed cargo hauler rather than a Royal Navy warship, lamenting that she would sail like a haystack. For the next year, Cochrane was relegated to patrolling Northern Europe, remarking that it was literally naval exile in a tub. However, in May 1804, St. Vincent was replaced by Lord Melville, who had more appreciation for Cochrane's achievements, and in autumn gave Cochrane command of a vessel worthy of his talents, the HMS Pallas. She was a brand new, top-of-the-line 5th-rate Thames-class frigate, armed with 36 cannons. Her deck was nearly twice as long as the HMS Speedy, and had a crew capacity thrice as large. Pallas was a sleek weapon of destruction. By the turn of 1806, HMS Pallas had become an infamous menace to both France and Spain. In one cruise along the Azore Islands, she had captured 4 Spanish treasure galleons heavily laden with New World silver, depriving the Spanish treasury of millions of dollars worth of capital. Cochrane was then deployed to the coasts around the Bay of Biscay, where he harried a dozen more French vessels. Pallas's most noteworthy action came on the 5th of April 1806. Cochrane heard word of a squadron of French corvettes anchored down the estuary of the Garonne River. The waters and coastline did not make open battle favourable. Thus, Cochrane waited patiently for nightfall and anchored his frigate at the mouth of the river estuary. From there, he appointed his lieutenant John Haswell to take 180 of his crewmen and embark upon the boarding boats, rowing upriver along the shoreline under cover of darkness. Sure enough, this boarding party came upon a ship at anchor, Tapageuse, a 14-gun corvette serving as a guard ship for the rest of the French vessels upstream. At 3 AM, the crew of the Pallas launched themselves upon Tapageuse, catching the Frenchmen by surprise. After a brief but fierce skirmish, the British sailors prevailed, inducing the enemy's surrender. Yet things were soon to go sideways, for the shouts and musket fire from the melee had alerted the vessels upriver. Before Lieutenant Haswell was able to weigh Tapajou's anchor and return to the palace, his men were intercepted by another French gun brig. A broadside gunfight ensued, in which Haswell managed to use the captured vessel's cannon to subdue the foe. Despite this, the prize ship suffered damage to her rigging, stranding the majority of British seamen upriver. At sunrise, the crew remaining aboard the Pallas itself spotted 3 French corvettes bearing down upon them from the coastline. Cochrane was now vulnerable, as the majority of his men were still with Haswell far upstream. At full capacity, Pallas could potentially outgun 3 corvettes, but with only a paltry 40 men on her deck, it was a hopeless fight. Thinking quickly, Cochrane ordered his skeleton crew to fasten rope yarns to the furled sails. Then, in one motion, all the yarns were cut at once, loosing all sail in one go, giving off the illusion that Pallas was manned by a full crew. In Cochrane's own words, "The maneuver succeeded to a marvel. No sooner was our cloud of canvas thus suddenly let fall than the approaching vessels hauled the wind and ran off along shore." Pallas engaged in pursuit, blasting her bow guns into the stern of the first fleeing corvette. These were the only guns they had the ability to man, unbeknownst to the French captain, who deliberately ran his vessel aground upon the shore in a panic, the shock of the impact collapsing the vessel's mainmast. With one ship subdued, the vicious Cochrane relentlessly pursued the remaining 2 corvettes. Both ran themselves aground and wrecked their vessels rather than risk battle with Pallas. Overall, with only 1 frigate and a handful of boarding boats, Cochrane and his men had decommissioned 4 French warships and captured 1. It was a stunningly unlikely victory, won through iron will and quick wit. In the summer of 1806, Cochrane returned to Britain as a triumphant war hero, his fearless raids off the Bay of Biscay having earned him no small amount of fame. Napoleon himself, the newly crowned Emperor of France, had taken an interest in this particularly prolific captain's trail of destruction, and personally ordered his capture, bestowing upon him a new title, Le Loup de Mer, the Sea Wolf. Never one to rest on his laurels, Cochrane was far from finished with his seaborne marauding. In August of 1806, he was appointed to the HMS Impérieuse, a sturdy 38-cannon frigate that was significantly more powerful than Pallas. Impérieuse soon became an icon of glory for the British Navy, and a consistent scourge to France. It would be in 1808 when Cochrane hit his stride once more off the coasts of Spain. This was a year when the British Army was embroiled in a desperate land struggle across the Iberian Peninsula against their Napoleonic foe, and Cochrane's naval contributions to the war effort were invaluable. The writings of contemporary novelist Sir Walter Scott emphasize as much, claiming the captain had, with his single ship, kept the whole coast of Languedoc in alarm, destroyed telegraphs of utmost importance to the French, preventing troops being sent from that province into Spain, and excited such dismay that 2,000 men were drawn from Figueras to oppose him, men who otherwise would have been marching further into the peninsula. Despite his success, Cochrane continued to lament upon the lack of recognition he received from the British Admiralty, often claiming in his autobiography that they not only failed to give him any praise, but in fact cheated him and his crew out of their rightfully earned prize money. In June, the Impérieuse sailed for Montgat, a Catalonian fortress under the occupation of French troops under General Duchesne. With the help of Catalan guerrillas, he launched a 2-pronged assault on the coastal battery, capturing it soundly. He would later go on to seize and decipher French codebooks and occupy Fort Trinidad, causing invaluable losses in French manpower, intelligence, resources, and time. To many among friend and foe, the Sea Wolf had become larger than life, more vengeful spirit than man. It was this reputation that would see him conscripted into the largest fleet engagement of his life, a contest that would serve as the climax to his naval boldness and the peak of his hubris, the Battle of Basque Roads. In spring of 1809, a Royal Navy fleet was being hastily assembled by one Admiral Gambier in order to confront a French flotilla that had escaped a British blockade in Brest and now lay anchored in the well-protected mouth of the River Charente, a region known as Basque Roads. The French intention was to escape into the open Atlantic and harry British interests in the West Indies, which the British under no circumstances could allow. To this end, the Admiralty directly sought out its most dauntless post-captain. Cochrane's reputation as a maverick made using him a risky gamble, but his daring nature and unquestionable naval genius were exactly what the Royal Navy needed to complete the total destruction of the French Atlantic Fleet. At the Palace of Whitehall, Cochrane met with First Admiral Lord Mulgrave, who asked for the Scotsman's personal advice. The idea of using fireships was put on the table, and Cochrane insisted that the plan would only work if supplemented by ships laden with explosives and rockets to further eliminate the enemy's ability to resist amidst fire and chaos. Satisfied with this plan, Lord Mulgrave ordered Cochrane to join Admiral Gambier's fleet at Basque Roads and personally lead the fireship's charge. This dismayed the Scotsman, who personally despised Admiral Gambier, believing him to be the exact breed of corrupt aristocrat who had so often hampered his career. Despite his insistence, Mulgrave would not rescind the order, and Cochrane begrudgingly sailed Imperieuse to join the British war fleet. Cochrane arrived at Basque Roads on April 3rd, and found his suspicions of Admiral Gambier had proven to hold warrant. Gambier was a vacillating commander, an evangelical Christian who insisted on distributing religious tracts to his men, making them study them rather than actively planning an attack. The arrival and appointment of Lord Cochrane as head of the coming assault did not help matters. One Admiral Sir Eliab Harvey was enraged that he had been snubbed of the role in place of a junior officer, and fiercely denounced Gambier, calling him a psalm slinger, as well as claiming, "I never saw a man so unfit for the command of the fleet. If Admiral Nelson were here, he would not have anchored in Basque Roads at all, but would have dashed the enemy at once." Harvey had been the captain of the HMS Temeraire. He was a hero of the Battle of Trafalgar, yet he was sent to London and court-martialed all the same. His departure was an ill omen for the British fleet. The two fleets stood 9 miles apart from one another in an indefinite standoff. The French column, commanded by Admiral Zachary Almont, was comprised of 11 ships of the line and 4 frigates, organised into 2 rows, wedged between the tiny Ile d'Aix and the perilous shallow Boyard Shoal. Furthermore, a fortified garrison, complete with operational gun batteries, sat firmly on the island's northern edge. With both sides inaccessible to the British vessels, the French had secured their flanks and were firmly wedged in. Realising there was no time to waste, Cochrane asked for permission to convert the transport ships in Gambier's fleet into fireships and explosive vessels, which was granted. 3 explosion vessels were prepared, their holds packed with 1,500 barrels of gunpowder stuffed into casks and tied together, supplemented by 3,000 hand grenades, all tied to a long fuse lit from the ship's stern, giving its brave crew around 15 minutes to scuttle off in a lifeboat before the big detonation. 8 more prepared fire vessels arrived on April 10th, sent by Lord Melville. Having prepared his deadly squadron of suicidal vehicles, Cochrane asked Gambier for permission to begin the attack post-haste and charge straight for the French line. Gambier refused, denouncing the Scotsman's head-on tactics as sheer foolhardiness. This infuriated Cochrane, who countered that further delay would lead to the French admiral doubtlessly catching on to the fireship plan and putting safeguards in place, inevitably leading to the loss of more British lives. Sure enough, The next morning's sun revealed the existence of a massive boom that barricaded the narrow channel between the fortress at Daix and the Boyar Shoal. Furthermore, Admiral Almor had in fact been made aware of the British fireships, and had ordered the front row of his ships of the line to point forward to present a smaller target. 70 canoes were deployed to wait by the boom, equipped with towing lines so as to tug any approaching fireships out of harm's way, while the French frigates too sailed ahead of the fleet to guard the harbour chain against British incursions. As day turned to dusk on April 11th, the winds began to churn, turning the coastal seas into a choppy tempest. It was at this time that Gambier finally approved the fireship's assault, perhaps taking advantage of the poor conditions to discourage Cochrane. Nevertheless, the Seawolf was undeterred and pressed forward with his plan. His crew was made up purely of volunteers, as fireships fell outside the conventional boundaries of warfare, and sailors captured by the enemy while operating them would not be taken prisoner, but instead executed. At around 8 PM, 3 explosive ships barreled down towards the French boom, taking advantage of the flood tide. One was captained by Frederick Maillat, one of Cochrane's most trustworthy officers, while the Seawolf captained one himself, taking the lead. At around 8:30, Cochrane determined that his floating bomb was around 10 minutes away from the boom. He commanded his crew immediately proceed to the lifeboats to evacuate, and personally lit the fuse, creating a countdown for his vessel's imminent explosion. Together they boarded the dinghy and rowed vigorously against the currents to get out of range of the incoming blast, only to discover about 100 yards out that they had left their mascot dog on board. Refusing to let his pooch get blown up, Cochrane rowed back for the floating time bomb, climbed aboard, grabbed the dog, and jumped back into the dinghy, once more rowing away with extra vigour. Soon, the floating bomb hit the boom, and a massive explosion illuminated the night sky, a veritable fireworks display of destruction. The explosive vessel was torn apart, and in turn shredded the massive chain that stood between the Royal Navy and its foe. 10 minutes later, Maillat's vessel collided with what remained, creating a second eruption, which scattered the French canoes that had been waiting to tow away the attackers. This annihilation completely dumbfounded Admiral Almor, for fireships were one thing, but in no world could he imagine his opponent creating explosive vessels, a monstrosity that disregarded every convention of civilized warfare. The third explosion vessel had run aground and been put out of commission, but the way was now cleared and it was time for the inferno. At 9:30 PM, 20 British fireships began their way down the channel. The French frigate Vanguard quickly cut their anchor lines and fled hastily back towards the main fleet. Yet the fireships soon encountered trouble. The choppy currents made their navigation perilous, causing many captains to panic, then light and abandon their ships too early, causing the burning husks to drift harmlessly into the shoals on either side of the channel. However, the stormy sea worked too in the British favour, rendering the waters too perilous for their French foes to manoeuvre. Of 20 fireships, 4 managed to make it into the French anchorage, and from there, chaos was the order of the night. A flaming vessel latched onto the 74-gun Régulus, causing the ship of the line to crash into its fellow French Tourville. Several more ships were set alight as rockets flared chaotically across wooden decks. Men drowned diving overboard to escape the flames, creating a scene of panic incarnate. By daybreak, it was revealed that of 14 French ships, all but 2 had been damaged and run aground on the nearby mudflats in an attempt to evade the fires, rendered completely immobile. Cochrane had since made it back to the Imperieuse and knew that the time to strike was now, when the enemy was trapped and helpless. Yet Admiral Gambier refused to give the order. Cochrane was floored with disbelief, unable to comprehend how a man with 11 battleships and 7 frigates at his disposal refused to engage an enemy who at current had only 2 operational vessels. By noon, the Océan and 4 other French ships had been put back afloat and were retreating deep into the mouth of the River Charente. Knowing that total victory was slipping out between his fingers, Cochrane committed an act of blatant insubordination, launching HMS Imperieuse deep into the Gulf alone to take on the entire French fleet single-handedly, saying later in his own words, "It was better to risk the frigate, or even my commission, than suffer a disgraceful termination to the expectations of the Admiralty." Imperieuse engaged the beached vessel Calcutta, with the 2 warships exchanging deadly broadsides, with the British frigate at an immense advantage. Simultaneously, Cochrane ordered his bow and stern cannons fired into the Aquilon and Ville de Varsovie respectively. Beached they may have been, but a single frigate was still engaged in a duel with 3 ships of the line twice its size. Soon the Calcutta surrendered and was captured by Cochrane's crew. It was at this point that Gambier finally sent some backup into the channel, unable to let one impetuous captain take on the entire French navy. 5 frigates and 2 ships of the line entered Basque Roads. Calcutta was abandoned and set aflame, while the Aquilon and Ville de Varsovie quickly surrendered. A 4th ship, Tonnerre, was scuttled by its own crew. The Battle of Basque Roads was undoubtedly a victory for the Royal Navy, who had sunk 3 French ships of the line, a 4th rate and a frigate, all while losing only 30 men and no ships of their own. However, had Gambier shown any initiative, the entire French Atlantic fleet could have been destroyed in the space of the morning, whereas now the majority of it would live to fight another day. Cochrane remained infuriated by Admiral Gambier's incompetence, and upon returning to England, publicly shamed him for his conduct. Defiance in the face of authority was nothing new to Cochrane, but never before had he been so enraged or so viciously ripped into the personal character of such a powerful, well-connected man. Gambier demanded a court-martial to determine his innocence. Naturally, the tribunal was stacked with aristocrats sympathetic to him, and the admiral was exonerated from all wrongdoing, while Cochrane, known for his impudence, had suffered a dire blow to his reputation. This incident compelled Cochrane to refuse further naval appointments, and from 1809 onwards, the Wolf of the Sea focused on his career as a member of the British Parliament. Indeed, Cochrane had pursued political ambitions since 1806, when he'd first been elected as a representative of the Riding of Honiton, and later Westminster, acting as MP concurrently with his naval service. He used his position to campaign for hard naval reforms, becoming an outspoken critic of the corruption in the Royal Navy. The following years saw Cochrane's popularity increased with the common people, as he continued to relentlessly campaign against the aristocrats. Yet he had few friends in Parliament, and near none amongst the Lordship and Admiralty. In 1814, Cochrane was implicated in a great stock exchange fraud, accused of deliberately misleading the public about Napoleon's death to increase the value of his government securities shares. Naturally, the young lord protested his innocence, but his words fell deaf upon the courts, who had likely been bought out by his many shadowy enemies, acting vindictively upon him for his attempts to disrupt their status quo. As punishment for his alleged fraud, Cochrane was dishonourably expelled from Parliament and formally discharged from the Royal Navy, an institution he had won countless victories for. His honours were revoked, and he was sentenced to 12 months in jail. It was there, in the dour walls of King's Bench Prison, that this chapter of the Sea Wolf's story came to an end. Join us next episode to discover how the disgraced Lord of Dundonald picked up the shredded tatters of his life and embarked upon an entirely new horizon, leaving the shores of the nation that had scorned him to become a hero to the freedom fighters of Chile, Peru, and Brazil. We would like to express our gratitude to our Patreon supporters and channel members who make the creation of our videos possible. Now you can also support us by buying our merchandise via the link in the description. This is the Kings and Generals channel, and we will catch you on the next one.